Hello, hello. Steve, Canadian Sasquatch. Welcoming you guys back to Mead Monday. That's right, we're back to me answering your guys' questions on Mondays. And let's just jump straight into it. You guys have been waiting long enough. We're not going to do the usual nonsense spiel. Joe Graves came up with a good question. He wants to know more about Fusels. I've been talking a little bit about Fusels in my Thirsty Thursday mead reviews. The homebrews typically have a little bit of them going on. And we're going to get into what they are and how we can prevent them and what we can do should they rear their head after we've done everything we can already. So let's get to it. So what are Fusels? Fusels are a group of different alcohols, which is part of the natural fermentation process. They'll always be there, but we can limit their production just even a little bit. Here's a list of a variety of Fusels and esters because they are very similar in production, because you can't. The yeast also produces esters as well as Fusels, and they're all just different types of alcohols and flavors that come from those different alcohols. As you can see right here, there are a bunch of different chemicals that make up the Fusels. Some of them you may be familiar with, some of them probably not, because they are a bunch of funny long names and whatnot in there. So things, some of them are also extremely deadly. This is why when you're distilling, you need to be extra careful. Distilling will concentrate some of the Fusels, which if drank straight up, bad things will happen, like blindness, death, you know, the standard spiel. So don't distill unless you know what you're doing and are doing someplace where it's legal. For us home brewers, it's not legal in the US, so don't do it. So the most familiar flavor and aroma that you might come across when dealing with Fusels is like a solvent flavor. Stuff like paint thinner or nail polish remover, 100% acetone, rubbing alcohol, isopropyl alcohol. Those are Fusels. So Fusels aren't actually bad. They're good for other things like solvent, paint remover, and rubbing alcohol for sanitizing your skin when you cut yourself up. So if you've ever like cracked one of these open, smelled it, and it was like, you know what this smells like, acetone. You know what the isopropyl alcohol smells like. That's the high alcohol solvent aromas. Don't know what it tastes like because we're not going to be drinking this stuff now. This is deadly stuff. This is some of the stuff that will cause blindness, death, and all that schnazzy stuff. So don't drink that stuff to see what it tastes like. Just don't. Trust me on that one. There are other flavors and aromas though, spicy type flavors, not like a jalapeno or a habanero, that kind of spicy, but more cinnamon or clove or allspice. Quite often with Belgian beers, they shoot for those esters that give off those flavors. And as we saw, esters and Fusels are kind of the same thing, just a different name for a different type of alcohol. So the esters usually give us the more pleasant flavors versus the Fusels, which are the less pleasant ones. But some of the Fusels still do bring about those pleasant flavors as well. And another familiar Fusel flavor or aroma, or both, is burned rubber. Sometimes you will get that aroma or flavor in your mead or beer, and that is because it's of a Fusel has popped its ugly head in there and decided to make it smell bad. So what causes Fusels to start with? It's typically stress. The main one is temperature. The yeast will be stressed if the temperature is too high. I've talked about yeast sweat before, where just like a human being, if you get hot, you start sweating. Sweat is not a pleasant flavor or aroma. It's the same thing with yeast. They will sweat out and they will give off those fusels, which is their sweat, which is the bad odors and flavors. That's caused because of the higher temperatures, but also when they're under stress for other reasons, like if you're very anxious waiting at a doctor's office or about to go on stage to talk to like 1,000 people, what happens? You quite often get sweaty hands, get all toasty and sweaty. It's the same thing with yeast. They are stressing, so they're sweating, getting those sweaty fusels out. And when I talk about the sweating, they're not actually sweating. It's just the best way that I can think of to convey the message. It's typically from eating and burping it out, just as yeast do. But the visual of yeast sweat, I think, helps convey what is actually going on there. They're stressed, they're sweating, they're causing those off flavors. So another thing that could cause the fusels to pop up is if you leave your beverage on their lees, which is wine or mead, the layer on the bottom, or the trub, which is the beer version of the sludge on the bottom. If you leave them sitting on that for a long time, the yeast could end up starting to eat some of the bad chemicals that are down in that, left over quite often from hot breaks or cold breaks, specifically in beer. You don't so much have that in mead and wine because you don't have a cold break or a hot break. But with beer, the trub could definitely have some of those funky chemicals that the yeast will eat. And what happens when you eat something that's bad, quite often you start breaking out in a sweat and getting sickly and all that. And that's what's happening with the yeast. They're eating a poison, they're getting sickly, they're stressing, they are putting out those fusels. So those are the main things that usually cause fusels. Sitting around on the lees or the trub is probably the least likely to happen, but it is something that can happen. So if you have like a lot of sludge on the bottom, it's usually a good sign that it's time to rack it off fairly quickly. So how do we prevent fusels? Well, the easiest one really is temperature. Most fusels come from temperature issues. So if we can control the temperature of what we're brewing, then we can eliminate most of the fusels. All yeast have an ideal range of temperature to ferment at. So let's take D47 for example. It ferments at 59 to 68 Fahrenheit. That's its happy range. 15 to 20 Celsius for my fellow Canadians and everybody else in the world besides the Americans. What you really want to do though is you want to ferment on the lower side of that scale. So the 60 Fahrenheit or the 15 Celsius, you want to ferment down on that side. That'll make the yeast happier. It won't be overheating and sweating because it's too hot for them. So the best way to control that temperature is keeping that beverage while it's fermenting someplace cool, within those temperature ranges, like a cool closet, cupboard, or even better yet, a fermentation chamber. But you also need to keep in mind that the yeast will heat up the beverage because they're eating and producing body heat in there, which warms the thing up. So if you're fermenting in like a temperature controlled area where you have a thermometer, you stick that on the side of your fermentation vessel, and that way you get a closer representation of what the fermentation temperature is, so you can adjust it more easily. Or if you don't have a way to do that, then what I typically will do, because I'm too lazy to stick the thermometer to the side, is I'll just bring the ambient temperature down like 1 or 2 degrees below what I really want to ferment at, because the yeast will create that extra 1 or 2 degree temperature, especially in the larger 5-gallon batches. The smaller the batch, the less heat they're going to produce, so keep that temperature back up to closer to your fermentation, your ideal fermentation temperature. So the next stress that we'll try and address is making sure that they are fed correctly. One of the things, especially in mead, is there isn't a lot of nutrients in honey. So the yeast will go in there and they'll just chow down on all that honey and essentially get sick. Like if you were to go out and just gorge silly on candy, you'd be sick. You need some other nutrients. Like you can think of it as like nutrients are like the vegetables and proteins that you need to be able to better process those sugars as well. So if you can keep the nutrients at a good level for the yeast, then there'll be less stress. They won't get sick from eating too much sugar all at once. All right, camera issues. So I was talking about yeast and eating and making sure that they have enough nutrients to counterbalance the amount of sugars that they have to go through. So you balance it out. And you don't want to give them too many nutrients, because that as well will make them fat and stupid, and not want to do their jobs, and stresses them out. And this is why with mead making we have SNA, or staggered nutrient additions, where we plan out how much nutrients to give to the yeast throughout the fermentation cycle. So we just want to make sure that the yeast have a happy amount of nutrients to go with all those sugars that they're going to gorge themselves on, to make it sure they process it correctly. Another thing that could happen for stressing is having too much or too little yeast. Yeah, it is a thing, but think about it. If you have not enough yeast, then you have all these yeasts that are just gorging themselves stupid, trying to eat all these sugars and nutrients. If you have the correct amount of yeast, then you have the yeast being all happy and being able to eat just enough, because there's another yeast that's eating just enough, and all these yeast are eating just enough that there's no leftovers, there's no waste, nobody's starving, so they're just all happy. Now, if you have too many yeast, then you have more yeast than food, and so you have some yeast that are coming in and gorging on the food, and other yeasts that are starving, literally starving to death, because they're not getting anything, because all these other yeast are in there. And so yeah, it's another one of those balancing acts to make sure that you have the correct number of yeast. For the most part, it's fairly easy for us homebrewers to do it, because we got our package of yeast, either the liquid one or the dry package, and most of those are good for like between 1 and 5 gallons, and we don't have to worry about it. The higher the gravity, then you do want to add more, because there's more sugars, so more yeast need to get in there. So yeah, so that's another stressing issue, is the higher gravity beverages, like the imperial stouts, the barley wines, the huge meads, the huge wines. Those have way too many sugars for a typical amount of yeast that we would do. So we quite often want to add some extra yeast for it. like 2 packages would be fantastic for a beverage that has a gravity over like 1.1-ish typically. So yeah, so the high gravity also ties into making sure you have enough yeast. Another thing that could be an issue is the pH level. If the pH is too high, the yeast will stress. If the pH is too low, then the yeast will stress. Usually the pH being too low or too acidic is the case for a lot of time. So you want to make sure you get those pH levels within the happy range for the yeast. And it depends on what beverage you're doing. I'll put a do right here. So yeah, you want to make sure those pH levels are correct, because if it's too acidic, then their face is going to melt. It's like you've seen all those movies where the acid splashes them in the face and their face melts. Blah. Well, it's the same thing with yeast. If it's too acidic, their faces are going to melt. If it's too base, again, think of a strong base like lye. What does that do? That melts flesh. So again, too much base, too high of a pH, face melting. Too low, too acidic, face melting. So you want to keep it right there in the happy middle. And the last thing that we can do to help prevent fusels from happening, not necessarily completely prevent, because it happens no matter what, but to limit how much happens, we get your beverage off of the sludge on the bottom. Lees for wine or mead, Trub for beer. Just get it off of that as soon as there is a good amount of sludge down there, and just rack it off. That will make the yeast much happier because they don't have to deal with all the poisons and stuff that are going on down there. Then the last part of this whole thing is what to do if the fusels are there, causing off flavors that we do not like. The easiest way to handle fusels is age. You can just let it sit in a carboy for however long you want. For the most part, a lot of the fusel flavors and aromas will age out. Quite often you hear people wanting to age their imperial stouts, their barley wines, their 18% meads, and you want to age those because over time those hot fusel flavors and aromas will mellow down, and that's the fusels mellowing down, so you don't get those hot solvents and whatnot. So it's more of a, they break down and just become much more pleasant. So age is a great way. If you've made something and you don't have the ability to age it for whatever reason, what you can do is add other flavors to help cover those fusels. Depending on what you made, you might want to add more fruit just to kind of cover them up. Back sweetening a mead will definitely help cover up some of those hot fusels. So just think about what you have for your beverage, the flavor profile you're trying to go for, and what else you can add to it to cover up those fusels. Wow, that was a lot of stuff there. Hopefully you guys found it useful. Hopefully I was coherent enough to make it useful. Just remember, don't worry about it. Don't overthink it. The best thing you can do is temperature control. Keep those temperatures down when you're fermenting. After it's done fermenting, then you don't have to worry about the temperature as much, because the yeast are no longer doing their thing, so they won't off-put any fusels or anything after the fermentation is done. But during that initial couple of weeks, make sure those temperatures are down and make sure their yeast are happily fed, and that's pretty much the best way to make sure your beverages are tasty and don't have those off flavors. And with that, my friends, this Mead Monday is done. thank you so much for hanging in there, and welcome back to the Mead Monday. If you've enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up. If you didn't enjoy the video, give me a thumbs down. Let me know why you're giving me a thumbs down so I can turn that thumbs down into a thumbs up. And while you're down there hitting that thumbs up, go ahead and hit the subscribe button if you haven't, and ring that bell so you can be notified when my next video comes out. With that, my friends, don't forget to send me some questions for Mead Monday since we're back at it, baby. And also, be sure to have a pint of awesome. I know I will. Cheers, everybody.